And now we're working on Skyping with Rabbi Reuven Chaim Klein. So while they're Skyping him in, and okay, I see it's starting to come up my screen, so that means we're definitely getting closer. That's always a good thing. Interesting enough, one of the things discussed a lot in this Torah portion is about the Levites and the different jobs they had. They actually there were 3 families of Levites, and each family had a specific job. Very important jobs. You weren't allowed to mix jobs. You had to do exactly what the job was, whether it was carrying parts. Oh, we'll get back to this later. I see my guest, Reuven Chaim. Are you there?
Yes, I'm here. Can you see me?
I see you. Rabbi, I warned you. I can see you. Everyone can see you, but you can't see me. Sorry, that's the way the system is set up. How are you today?
Very good, thank God.
Okay, all the way from Israel. You gotta love Skype. What?
Yeah, thank you for the invitation. I'm so honored and privileged to be here.
I am so happy. I enjoyed your book. We're going to talk about your book, God versus Gods. The first God you can see right behind Reuven Chaim is a big G. If you see the small line behind, it's a little g. So before we get rolling, who is Reuven Chaim Klein?
Very good question. So I grew up in the Valley, if you're familiar with the community in Los Angeles, California, Valley Village, California, North Hollywood, whatever you want to call it. I went to yeshiva there, Emek Hebrew Academy for elementary school, went to Yeshiva Gedol of Los Angeles for high school and Beis Medrash. Then it came to the Mir in Eretz Yisrael here in Yerushalayim, and I've been studying in the Mir more or less since then, since I was 19 years old, studying in the Mir. I spent a year in Lakewood, New Jersey, studying in Beis Medrash Gavoa, and that's basically Reuven Chaim Klein in a nutshell.
Perfect.
I spend most of the day studying Gemara. I work on some books. I do some editing. Different projects. That's basically it.
Beautiful. And today we're going to talk about your newest book, God versus Gods. So your book, I mean, it's like part encyclopedia, part history, like an in-depth understanding of idol worship through the prophets. So the first question is, before we get involved in the book itself, why did you get involved in this project? Because it is a project.
Well, it's like this. I was always interested in history and archaeology and things like that. For fun, I read history books and archaeological studies, and these things are interest me. And then on the other hand, I learned Gemara, I learned Chazal, I learned Torah studies, and I was thinking of a way that how can we synthesize these two things and make something that's related to history and it's related to Judaism and put it together. So my first book was actually on the history of the Hebrew language. It's called Lashon HaKodesh, History, Holiness, and Hebrew. So that was also using a lot of Jewish sources, a lot of secular sources, academic sources, and putting it together. When you look at history and specifically in archaeology, one of the main things that you see in archaeology is that everything has to do with idolatry. The most archaeological findings have to do with inscriptions of mythologies, idols, different ritual items that people had. So almost everything that has to do with archaeology has to do with idolatry. So now you look at the Bible and see, what does the Bible say about idolatry? Wait, most of the Bible is actually rallying against idolatry. So what's going on over here? A lot of the times when we study Tanakh, when we study the Bible, so we look at the parts of the Bible that have to do with idolatry as sort of, the filler material. You just gloss over it, you ignore it. But the truth is that if you look really closely, and you don't have to look so closely, if you just look at it simply, you'll see that there's something much more going on. And my book basically tries to fill in those blanks and doesn't ignore it like most people. When you read the Bible, you just ignore it talks about Baal. I don't know what that is, whatever. Something called Baal that the prophets are rallying against. But the truth is that most of the Bible is trying to tell us a lesson of, don't worship idolatry, don't worship multiple gods. There's only one God. And, that's just lost on most people because we don't understand the historical context.
Yeah, that's actually me. Every time you gloss over, they did this idol, they did that idol, and right. Then they got in trouble.
Let's get to the juicy part.
Right, the armies came, they got invaded, and then the judge came and saved them, and the king came, over and over and over. And that's what we want to dive into. So just to, almost start from the beginning, what is the history of idol worship? What does that mean even? What happened? God created the world, there's one man, he knows about God, and all of a sudden, 1,000 years later, the whole world wants to idol worship. What happened?
So, I mean, there's different ways to look at it, but if we go with the most famous explanation, which is that of the Rambam, Maimonides, in the beginning of his history, in the beginning of his laws of idol worship, laws of Avodah Zarah, so he actually goes through the history of what happened to Avodah Zarah and how that developed from, humankind being monolithically monotheistic, because when God created Adam, so there was only one person, and he knew that there was only one God, so there was nothing to talk about. But as humanity developed and it became more populous, so people started coming up with all kinds of other ideas. So the way Maimonides puts it, Maimonides says that originally man knew about God, only one God, and there was only one God that was worshipped. But what happened was that people thought that the way that we should worship God is by giving honor to those elements of nature that God gave honor to. So they would say, for example, like, oh, God took the sun and the moon and he put them in these lofty positions up in the sky, so we should also worship the sun and the moon. That's sort of how it started off. In Maimonides' estimation, idolatry started off as a simple mistake. They thought that this is what God wanted of them. And then it developed into more sophisticated and complex cults of exactly how to worship different forces, and then different things that represented those forces so you can get to them closer. But that's in a nutshell what Maimonides says. Others want to say that the people who invented idolatry were doing it in a more wanton or in a more advertent way of trying to bring mankind into a cult, maybe trying to unite mankind for their own purposes. Like we see, like a sort of for political reasons, they wanted to create a common God or a common enemy and things like that. So that's how other sources would view idolatry, or the development of idolatry.
Right. So again, let's keep it simple. But according to either of these two ways of thinking, was there anything to the idolatry, or was just a waste of everybody's time and the world just ran and who cared?
So again, this is also it's a very complex question. If you look in the Bible, you can bring proofs to both the sides of the argument. In a nutshell, basically, Maimonides says that there's nothing to it, and it doesn't have any reality, and it just maybe gave people a psychological high that they felt that they could control the world. But other than that, there's nothing to it. Other sources want to say that idolatry represents sort of forces of evil, that you can tap into forces of evil. That's more like the Kabbalistic way of looking at things. So it's a little bit more complicated to say on one foot exactly how to look at it. But there's sort of these two traditions in Jewish thought in how to look at the efficacy of idolatry.
So I think we're gonna speed ahead in history, because I was thinking about asking about the golden calf, but I'd rather scoot past that one because that's going to be its own conversation one day. So the Jewish people, we get the Torah. We just had
a whole chapter on the golden calf.
I know. I read the book and I read the encyclopedia part. I know, but so I want to move us along. We get the Torah, God reveals himself to us, we just had the Shavuot holiday, then we make some very bad mistakes, and we end up wandering for 40 years in the desert. Joshua brings us in to the land of Israel. We're supposed to wipe out everybody so we don't get involved in their idols, but not too soon afterwards, as the parts you say we gloss over, it says the Jewish people keep getting involved in idols, or we keep getting punished. What were we doing? What was happening?
Okay, so there's different ways to look at it also, and it's a lot of these things are complex issues. But what happened was, it seems that in the times of after Joshua died, in what's called the Book of Shoftim, the Book of the Judges, so we find that there's sort of like a roller coaster where the Jews are doing well, and then they're doing well in political ways, and they're conquering the land, and then they're going up, and then they sort of forget about God and start worshiping other things, whether it's in tandem with God or as separate gods or as media or intermediaries to get to the one Hashem, the one God. They forget about it. They start going down, and then they start having political losses and political defeats and subjugation to other kingdoms, and then God will send another leader, and another leader will bring them again political success along with religious renewal, religious revival, bring them back to the one God, and then they'll be okay. And then when the leader dies, the whole thing happens again. So you have sort of this cycle of loyalty to God versus disloyalty to God. What exactly that disloyalty entails. A plain reading of the text of the Bible suggests that they were actually worshiping idolatry. Others want to say that it wasn't so simple, that they were actually literally worshiping idolatry. Some say that it means that the leaders weren't ruling with enough power or with enough authority to put a stop to things that weren't going on. So the Bible sort of exaggerates different things that were happening over there to make a point of, this is a really serious thing that was going on.
So when they were doing this, whatever we'll identify as idol worship, so when they're bowing down to that idol, were they keeping the Torah? Were they doing all the other stuff? Or they were completely like a new religion and then all of a sudden back to the old religion? They studied Torah, they didn't study Torah. What exactly was give us a feeling of what it was like in those days?
So it's a good question. A lot of people think that if you're worshiping idolatry, that's like the worst thing you can do. If you're worshiping idolatry, that means you're completely lost from Judaism, and you're probably not keeping kashrut or you're not keeping Shabbat. You're completely gone, and you don't keep the rest of the Torah. But there's a lot of other sources, and there's definitely support for this in the Talmud and in a lot of other commentators, that they want to say that no, even the people that were worshiping idolatry, they had a certain drive. There was what we would call a Yetzer HaRa, an evil inclination, that pushed them towards committing the sin of idolatry, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they had forsaken the Torah altogether. They were still following the other laws of the Torah, but they were doing this, this one evil thing over there on the side.
So it's very interesting. Now, so did they feel that they were contradicting themselves? Did they walk? They may have walked around dressed like me and you, and argued who's more religious and how you're supposed to do this command and that command. Except I'm also doing idol worship. I mean, it sounds a little confusing if you would be the kids.
Yeah, definitely true, and that's an interesting point. What I don't know if I'm not aware of any sources of what they themselves, how they themselves looked at themselves. They probably, there's sources that suggest that they thought that their idolatry was actually justified by the Torah in some perverse way. There's a story in Tanakh where there's a person named Yehoyada, and he gives them rebuke for worshiping idolatry, and then they stoned him in the temple. There was a Kohen named Yehoyada. They stoned him in the temple. And if you look at the Torah, so the punishment of stoning is something that you give to people that worship idolatry, and people that have committed the worst types of sins. So the idolaters looked at somebody who's loyal to God as committing the worst type of sin. They gave him stoning. It's a very interesting point that you're making there. That I'm not sure of any explicit sources that discuss how they looked at themselves. Did they think that they were justified? Were they looking at the Torah as something separate? There were definitely times in history where it seems like the Jews were actually confused. They weren't sure what was the legitimate, what did the Torah really want from them. There were.
It's fascinating. I know I'm usually very good following my notes, but I'm way off my notes now. But just one more, and then I'm going to bring us back. That's what my notes are for. Yeah, the Torah talks about courts and witnesses, and the Talmud talks about it. So people are doing idol worship all over the place. So you would think, let some witnesses come and say, hey, if you do that, it's idol worship. We're going to bring you to the court and have you killed. Was that happening?
I don't know.
Yeah, it's
not sure.
Something fascinating. I'll bring us back, but it's what to think about. What was happening? That's your next book, I hope.
Yeah. Well, actually, the next book is going to focus more on the philosophy and the theology of the struggle between monotheism and polytheism. That's this book is more on the history, so that's going to be more on the ideas behind idolatry and Judaism and stuff like that.
Cool. It'll be your third book. Third book. All right, so let's get back into the history. So, again, many people should be familiar. You have the 10 tribes split off from the tribe of Judah, and you had the king, and the king was nervous that if everyone would go up to the temple, and it's funny because all the rules exist, right? You're going to go up to the temple, and the king of Judah can sit on the Temple Mount, and the king of the 10 tribes or the king of Israel can't sit on the Temple Mount. Now, what's going to happen is everyone's going to go back to the king of Judah. So he set up what would seem to be idols. So people wouldn't go up. Were those really idols, or in the way we think of idols?
So an idol is basically a physical representation of something. Now the question is it a physical representation of the one God, which happens to be illegal because you can't represent one God with a physical representation, with a physical idol or an icon, because we understand that God is incorporeal. He doesn't have a body, and therefore you can't say that like this image represents God or reminds us of God, because God is just so transcendental in that way that like we can't relate to him with an icon or with something that's like God. So the question is, were these idols that, let's say, as you mentioned, Jeroboam, the first king of the kingdom of Israel, those idols, the 2 golden calves that he erected, were they actually separate gods? He was worshiping a different deity, or was he worshiping the one God, what we call Hashem, through this idol as like a medium or an intermediary? So the different commentators discuss that, and what it seems is that Jeroboam was not as bad as, let's say, what we call him in Hebrew, Achav or Ahab, who actually brought in, he imported foreign gods from the Canaanites, or who lived in north of Israel, in modern-day Lebanon. He brought in foreign gods of Baal to the Jewish people. That was what Ahab did. But Jeroboam wasn't so bad. He was still worshiping the same one God, but he was doing it in an illegal, illegitimate, illicit way of doing so through idols. That's what most of the commentators say. So there's sort of like a digression over there or a devolution in terms of the Jews' loyalty to God. First, there's like worshiping God in an illegitimate way, and then they come down to a lower step, and then they worship, not just God, they worship something else also altogether.
But when we study those verses, those passages, that part of history, the Bible certainly makes it sound like these are like the worst of the worst people. Is that because it's going to lead to things that are even worse, or maybe not? Like, why do we look at it as being so terrible? If it's, it's bad, but maybe it's not so bad.
I mean, first of all, we have to understand that idolatry is inherently evil. It's inherently bad. That's what the Torah is teaching us. That's what the Bible is teaching us. Idolatry is inherently evil. That's first of all. It's not because I don't think it's because it leads to something worse. Now, it happens to be that idolatry was historically associated with pretty bad things, sexual immorality, murder, things like that. So when the Bible is trying to say that like these people were pretty bad people, it's because you see that idolaters, they also they weren't so particular to refrain from murder or from other sexual impropriety.
Okay. So now I'm going to move us way ahead in history because my time is flying. And again, we're talking to Reuven Chaim Klein, author of, you see right behind them, God versus Gods. Yes. Now I see 3 of them because they're right behind you. And we're going to talk about how to get that before we're done. But the Talmud says at the beginning of the Second Temple, the rabbi said, we can't deal with this evil inclination for idol worship. And they prayed, and God said, no problem. And basically, he gave them the evil inclination, whatever that means. I hope you'll help us. The evil inclination for idol worship, and they got rid of it. So my question is, and it'll be especially true with how you explained to us Maimonides earlier, what did they really get rid of? And did they really eradicate idol worship? Those are the 2 questions I got for you.
Okay, so it's like this. I actually have a whole chapter on you probably know. The 7th chapter of my book discusses the Talmud talks about this whole story about how the beginning of the Second Temple period, they got rid of what's called the Yetzer HaRa for Avodah Zarah, the evil inclination for idolatry. So the question is, like, what does that mean? What was going on? The Talmud has a whole story where the rabbis were praying in the temple, and then a fire in the shape of a lion came out, and they captured it, and that represented this evil inclination. What's really sort of going on? So one way to look at it is that God expects a certain degree of loyalty to Him. He created the world. He wants us to serve Him. He doesn't want us to serve anything else. Now, the problem is that one of the reasons why God actually created the world is that He wants to, the main reason why He wanted to create the world is because He wants to do good to people. Right? They say that the word God is related to the word good. I don't know if that's true on an etymological level, but it's certainly true on a thematic level, that God is good. We said it in Psalms, Ta'amu Ru'u Ki Tov Hashem. You should taste and you should see, or you should think and you should see that God is good. God is good. He wants to do good to the world. Now, the classical way of doing good is to give somebody something. The problem is that if I want to give somebody a present that he doesn't deserve, so then he's going to feel embarrassed. In Kabbalistic sources, they call this the Nahama de Kisufa, the bread of embarrassment. It's when God just gives somebody something, a present, without him deserving it. So he's embarrassed. He's embarrassed because he received something that he doesn't really deserve. So the best type of good that God can do to a person is if a person does something and he deserves it, and then God gives him something good as retribution or as reward for that person doing good, right? You following?
Oh yeah.
So the idea is that when God wants to give us reward, he has to create another option in order to make it that you have your free choice, your free will. You made a decision to do good, and therefore you deserve reward, and now God is going to give you something good. That's how it has to work. If a person is doing something not of his own volition, he doesn't have a choice in the matter, he's doing it because he's forced to do it, or he feels like he's forced to do it, then it's not considered like he's doing something good. He's just doing there's no other option. He has to do good. Now, in a nutshell, in terms of worshiping idolatry, so if you have one awesome creator of the world, and he has all the powers in the world, of course you're only going to worship the one creator of the world, right? And then there's all kinds of philosophical and cosmological different proofs for the existence of God. We're not getting into that. But the point is that people knew there was only one God, and you're only going to worship one God. Now, the problem is that if you want to receive reward for worshiping God, so then there has to be another sort of viable option that you would think that, well, I can do this or I can worship God. And then by making the right decision, you can receive reward, right? So what God did was, in order to sort of make that balance, so you're not compelled to worship the one God, God created what's called the Yetzer HaRa for Avodah Zarah, the evil inclination, right? As its name implies, it inclines a person towards evil. It pushes you in the direction of worshiping the wrong thing, of doing the wrong thing. And that sort of makes now you have an equal choice. You can worship this awesome one God who has power over everything, or you have this push that's pushing you in the direction of worshiping multiple gods or worshiping other gods and other forces in the world and doing the wrong thing. And now when a person is faced with these two choices and he makes the right choice, so then he can receive the eternal reward from Hashem, and it's not going to be embarrassing. It's going to be the ultimate goodness, because it's a goodness that he deserves. So in a nutshell, what the Yetzer HaRa for Avodah Zarah is, it served a very good purpose. The purpose of the Yetzer HaRa for Avodah Zarah was to create an equilibrium and make it as if worshiping God and worshiping Avodah Zarah is an equal choice. You can choose this or you can choose this, and then the expectation is you're going to make the right decision, but you could also make the wrong decision. If you didn't have any Yetzer HaRa for Avodah Zarah pushing you in the direction of worshiping idolatry, so then you would be compelled to worship the one God, and it wouldn't even be a question, and then that wouldn't be considered using your free will.
Well, I know I'm interrupting you because my time is flying. So they got rid of that evil inclination to make sure. So because they couldn't handle it, they didn't want the reward for it. So the balance now has to switch. So if you could do it fast, because I want to make sure I get one more question out of you. Did it work? So
what it basically did, the ramifications of getting rid of the evil inclination for idolatry, the ramifications basically were that it toned down the entirety of creation. People used to be on a very spiritually aware level. People would be very aware of spirituality and God and godliness and things like that, and that drove them towards the worship of the spiritual, whether it was the one God or the illegitimate gods of the idolatry.
Got it. So now I have to. I know I'm interrupting you only because my time is flying. I barely have 2 minutes, but I must leave you with two things.
So much fun.
I know. They don't let me stay for as many hours as I want. I keep trying. They're not letting me. So 2 things. Number one, we need to know how can we get your book, and I can leave you with 30 seconds of anything you would like to leave us with. So let's do both. First, how do I get the book God versus Gods, and what would you like to leave us with?
Okay, so you can get the book in Jewish bookstores. At least they better be in the Jewish bookstores. You can get it on Amazon. You can email me. My email address is rcklein@or.edu. That's RCKLEIN or in Israel they call it a strudel with an A with a thingy around it, OHR.edu. Or you can just search me online, Reuven Chaim Klein. It's easier to find me.
Perfect. Now, what would you like to leave us with after we talk so much today?
So I just wanted to make one last appeal for the book, that this book is, for people that, let's just leave it like that. Basically, it's a resource for Bible study. It makes sophisticated Torah scholarship available in clear English. It's a defense of traditionalist perspectives, approaches, and it brings things down to help us understand the stories of Tanakh in a more mature way, not just like on a simple level like kids are taught Bible stories. This brings us down to a sophisticated, complex way of looking at things with multiple opinions and different ways to look at it.
And it definitely does, because as we spoke, at least through the emails, I read through the whole book. I like to say cover to cover, but the truth is the last part of the book is an encyclopedia of all the different kinds of idols that you run into when you study Bible. So I sort of glanced through different ones, learned tons of stuff. It opened my mind. I know I learned a lot today. Hopefully everybody learned a lot, but really, really to sink your teeth into it, go ahead, go purchase the book, God versus Gods. You can get it on Amazon, walk into your Jewish bookstore. Reuven Chaim, I appreciate the time. Thank you for joining us. Thank much to discuss. Oh, yeah, we could do this again because I didn't get through all my questions, so I got a little gypped. So thank you again. Have a great Shabbos, and I hope we'll be in touch.
You too. Thank you very much. Good Shabbos.
Okay. So I know we learned some stuff. We certainly weren't able to finish all the things we wanted to talk about. I had such a long list of stuff. I actually wanted to even talk about why people exaggerate so much, because this you find the Torah, and it's something good to keep in mind. The Torah is like a magnifying glass. So when we deal with great people, and people make mistakes, we're all human, but the Torah definitely magnifies. So one of the jobs is to understand how strong is this magnification. What is going on? The Torah still is obviously forbidding all kinds of idol worship. You have to know what idol worship is. You have to know what's allowed, what's not allowed. What you imagine is not so bad could be terrible. The only way we'll know it's terrible is when the Torah points it out. But this was our history through the Bible, through everything else. And here we go. My break is coming. Here comes my music. We're going to have one quick segment when we come back. So you're listening to Rabbi Tzvi on Let's Talk Torah, and we'll be right back.